Well, the wonderful thing about my classes and the things that I teach is that you don't have to believe a thing I say. You have the scriptures, the law, and the prophets, both ancient and modern, to become your sources rather than using me as a source. Well, this presentation is going to talk about a journey to the center of the earth, which will actually be a symbolic journey to the ritual center of the earth, talking about the myth and symbols of mountains, mounds, pyramids, altars, and temples in different cultures around the world. It seems like the myth is always the same no matter what. Well, we learn in the scripture, and darkness reigned upon the face of the deep. And the God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And waters covered the face of the earth. And the God said, "Let the earth come up dry." And the gods caused the dry land to appear. And when that dry land appeared, this became known as the Primordial Mound, the center of the earth. The primeval hillock is what it's sometimes called. The axis mundi, the navel of the earth. The world mountain, the stone of creation. These are all words and phrases that are used from different cultures. And it's because of this concept of this dry land coming out of the earth, that this dry land then puts boundaries to the waters of chaos, and then that height of that primordial mound or primeval hillock becomes the closest point between heaven and earth. And that's where altars are constructed. And the law of the altar in the Old Testament is that it has to be made out of unhewn stone and earth and water, because it has to represent that primordial mound that comes out of the waters of creation. We even see this in the story of Elijah on Mount Carmel, where he builds the altar, he constructs the altar of the unhewn stones, the 12 stones, and then he surrounds it in a sea of water, not only pouring water on top of the altar, but pouring water around it in an earthen basin around the altar, so it looks like this primordial mound is coming out of the waters of creation. Well, this closest point between heaven and earth are where altars are constructed, because altars are nothing more than a representation of this primordial mound. And that becomes the point, or the spot, where the 6 cardinal directions come together, north and south and east and west, in the land of the living, as well as one going up and one going down. That becomes the point, or that center point becomes the point of the 6 cardinal directions. One representing the world of the living, where the square of those cardinal directions come together, and then the circle of creation, the totality of creation. This always represents the world of the living. But because it's the six cardinal directions, it represents also the world of the gods that goes up above, as well as the world of the dead down below. So this is where time and space ceases to exist. In the world of the living, at that symbolic primordial mound, at that symbolic center, is where the 3 worlds come together, where time and space ceases to exist, and that's where temples are constructed. Because temples are that gateway, both for the dead, for the living, and for the gods. Now, anciently, this primordial mound, especially in Egypt, we're going to talk mostly about Egypt, that primordial mound was always manifest in the burial sites, and the buildings that were constructed over those building sites were constructed as a primordial mound. They called them mastaba or mastabas, is what they called them. And so you went from a mastaba to the step pyramid, and then to the pyramid, which all represents that primordial mound, is the way it works. The mastaba actually is what led to the very first pyramid, and that's the step pyramid of Saqqara of King Zoser. Now I'm going to talk about the step pyramid here for a minute. I'm going to show you a kind of a video that I've kind of looped and put together so that people can understand the step pyramid. Well, the pyramids always represent that primordial mound. Now, these at Giza, we think these are the oldest, but they are not the oldest. The oldest dates back to about 2700 BC, and it was the first pyramid constructed by King Zoser. And King Zoser had an architect that helped him design that very first pyramid. and that was in Saqqara, which is about 10 miles south of Giza. And the step pyramid, as we see here, as we're going to see parts of it here, is a mastaba or mastaba on top of a mastaba on top of a mastaba. And that's the way it was designed. The architect that designed this pyramid and constructed, that was in charge of the construction of this pyramid, was one that you may remember from the movie The Mummy, or the name you may remember. But the architect's name was Imhotep, a very intelligent, genius sort of guy. The entrance to every pyramid is always on the north side, and this is the burial pit. When you go into that entrance, you drop down into this burial pit, drop down into the ground, and that's where they found the sarcophagus of King Zoser, was down in the bottom here. And it was too large to take a single block of granite in there, so they took multiple blocks of granite and lowered them in there in order to create the sarcophagus of King Zoser. You can see how it's represented, or how it's mastaba on top of mastaba, and that creates a step pyramid, a lot like those in Mesopotamia. The ziggurat in Mesopotamia was a 7-tiered or 7-stepped pyramid in Mesopotamia. And so here at Saqqara, you have these mastaba on top of mastaba on top of mastaba that's set up there until they create that pyramid. And then it was in a temple complex, in a funerary complex that surrounded the pyramid, as well as there were multiple other pyramids in that same area, because this is Saqqara, in the area of the dead. So the mastaba is constructed, and then one on which represents that primordial mound, and then another one on top of that, and on top of that, and another one on top of that, is the way the architect designed it. That was later on faced, and that face becomes the pyramid that and the pyramid representing that primordial mound, and that place where the three worlds come together. Almost always the king is buried below the pyramid, and all the pyramids we see, except those at Giza, many think that the king was buried in the center of the pyramid, but I'm not sure that that's necessarily correct. The pyramids of Giza, even there's a lower chamber down below the pyramid, which is probably the actual burial site, and the treasures were probably in the upper chambers. So we see these three at Giza that we're most familiar with, and we think they're massive. They are some of the most massive ones we see anywhere in the world. That center one is actually smaller than the one on the right. The one on the right is Cheops. Then you have Khephren, and then Mycerinus. But it's just the one on the right is on a little lower elevation than the center one. But that's the one. These are the ones we look at mostly. The pyramids always have to face the cardinal directions. There's a connection there, and you can kind of see this diagram there. But the true north and the entrance to these pyramids are always on the north side, from true north, or to the true north. There's even a shaft in some of them. We'll see in a diagram. There's a shaft that actually runs to the North Star from the center. So as we talk about the concept of the primordial mound, it's going to be seen in ancient and modern temples and sacred sites around the world. And it's always the same, the primordial mound and that representation and what it means, or the concepts that it conveys to the community, are always the same. Now look at these as we go through some of these sacred sites and temples around the world. I want you to recognize the concept of the mountain and the center place. Again, this is where the three worlds come together, the closest point between heaven and earth. Here's one that actually is coming out of the water. This temple is rising out of the waters and represented as coming out of the waters of creation. And you can see how the mountain, or that primordial mound, is manifest in the peaks and the ascension motif, the many peaks in a mountain. We see them even in our own temples, how they represent mountain peaks. The rising up on both sides, as we see in many of the Japanese temples. Even in ancient Greece, the highest mountain, or the Acropolis that we call or visit, is on the mountaintop, and a sacred site representing that primordial mound. And it's not only where the gods reside, but it's where the law issues forth. With the columns, and we see the gabled end. We see that gabled end, which again represents a mountain, or that primordial mound, and you ascend up into the temple. The Mesa Temple is patterned after some of the oldest temples in Egypt with the crenellated walls, and it's in a cube, which represents the Holy of Holies in and of itself. There's many temple complexes around the world where there are multiple temples, and each temple again symbolically representing that primordial mound. In Mexico, Central America, we see them in Asia and China. They're just everywhere. And here's some temple complexes too, where there's multiple temples involved. Again, all representing that primordial mound. This is the ziggurat, or a pattern of the ziggurat in Mesopotamia. We have the temple in Canada, very much like that. And then, of course, Salt Lake representing the mountain peaks. And just as Isaiah says, the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established in the tops of the mountains. Because the mountain, anytime you read mountains in Scripture, you need to be looking for a temple type of text, some type of temple representation, or at least the ordinances or knowledge or the information that might be given in temples being manifest within the Scriptures that mentions the mountains. The earthly representation of the primordial mound, or the center of the earth, as it's often called, is always the temple, both ancient and modern, and has always been associated with the creation. Every ancient temple symbolized the creation and symbolized that primordial mound. The focal point of every temple, ancient and modern, is the top of that primordial mound, the Holy of Holies, the sanctuary. We might call it the celestial room, or even the presence of God. In the Egyptian temple, this is the temple at Karnak. In the Egyptian temple, the focal point is always the sanctuary. The highest point in the temple is the sanctuary, or Holy of Holies, which in this on the right, you can see it in the temple complex, in this temple here, and that's what the arrows are pointing to. This temple complex here is really, they call it an outdoor museum, is almost 200 acres in its size. Now, there are two different types of temples in the Middle East. You have straight axis temples and bent axis temples. A straight axis temple is if you come through the front door and go straight, you'll go right into the Holy of Holies, just like this temple is here. It's a straight axis temple. If you go through from the front door or through the pylons there, you'll come to that Holy of Holies. If you look at the picture on the left, you'll see that you can barely see that gate in the center, in the far distance. You can see that gate, which is that gate that you see in the lower right-hand corner. But that dark spot in the center is the Holy of Holies that you see. That dark spot in the left there, in the very center, in the very back, that dark spot is the Holy of Holies. Many of the temples in Mesopotamia were what's called a bent axis temple, and a bent axis temple is where you walk through the doors, often on the east or northeast side, and then you walk to the center of the building and you make a left-hand turn, at a 90 degree angle, and then you continue walking straight into the Holy of Holies, or the sanctuary. So that's what you see as you look at this. These pylons, the water, the bridge that this picture is taking from, the water used to be right here. That was the water. And so these pylons, this is what the facade here is, they're called pylons, but they're in the shape of the hieroglyphic for the primordial mound. They represent the mound, and then the waters would be right here. Coming out of the waters of creation would be this primordial mound. And as you would ascend through the temple, or travel through the temple, you're actually ascending in elevation until you reach the Holy of Holies. This is a plan of that particular temple. You can see the pylon on the left, which represents the primordial mound. The waters of the Nile would have been just to the left of that pylon. And then it's open. You have the open courtyard. And in that open courtyard, you see a building with 3 rooms in it. Those rooms are for the Father, three gods. They're 3 chapels, really for Khans, Ammon, and Mut. It's the Father and the Mother and the Son is what that chapel represents. And this is open to the air. You can see in that diagram at the top, that elevation, that longitudinal elevation, where the roof is clear, where it's white. That means it's open to the air, and where it's black on the top, you see that's where the ceiling, and the ceiling gets lower and lower. So So looking at the diagram below, you have the open air, which represents the creation. You have the dry land appearing in the pylons. Then you have the creation room there in what's called the Great Court, and then you go into the garden room, which is the hypostyle hall, which are all those columns. There's almost 150 columns here at Karnak, and each of those columns represent the capitals. They represent plants, either the lotus blossom or the papyrus plant, that are coming out of the waters of creation that create the garden or the garden area as you move towards that sanctuary. And you can see in this diagram how it's open at the top there. You have the pylon on the left, and then it's open to the air. And then the ceiling, the dark line on the top, that's the ceiling, and it gets lower, and it gets lower, and it gets lower. And as it gets lower, the ground gets higher and higher and higher until you get to the sanctuary. And the sanctuary represents that primordial mound, that closest point between heaven and earth. And that's where the sanctuary is. Now, you have the open air on the left, and it's open to the stars, but on the ceilings, as you move towards that sanctuary to the right, on the ceiling are stars are carved, and so the heavens get lower and lower, the same as the ground gets higher and higher until you get to the presence of God, which is that closest point between heaven and earth. This is, in the Primordial Mound, the myth or the tradition is that when the dry land appeared, this is where God stood in order to finish the rest of creation, and therefore it becomes a sacred site, a sacred spot. And that's why the altar is constructed there, and the altar represents that primordial mound because it's the closest point between heaven and earth, where those worlds come together. Even in the Temple of Solomon, and this is a diagram of the Temple of Solomon, it's what's called a tripartite temple. It has three different areas in it, but you'll notice that there's an ascension motif there too. You have what's called the vestibule, and then the holy place, and then the Holy of Holies, as you see on that lower diagram. But each one, you have to go up in elevation to get to the vestibule, which is called the ulam in the Hebrew, and then you go into the hekal, or the holy place, and it has to be 2 cubes. That this diagram doesn't show it right, but that's actually 2 perfect cubes, just like the Ark of the Covenant is 2 perfect cubes, was constructed as 2 perfect cubes together. And then the Holy of Holies, as you rise up into the Holy of Holies where the Ark of the Covenant was, that's a perfect cube. Also, it has to be a perfect cube, and the highest point because it represents that primordial mound. Here's another section. You can see kind of how it's open air on the pylon on the left. It's open, and then the ceiling gets lower and lower as the ground gets higher and higher, again representing that primordial mound. Now, this is the Holy of Holies at the Temple of Luxor. This is the Holy of Holies, as we saw in the very back as we look through that center port. In the front of the Holy of Holies, there's 2 columns. These 2 columns represent what the pharaoh has to do before he is worthy or prepared to go into the presence of God. And it's what's called the ritual embrace, and it's depicted 6 times on each column, 3 on the side that we're looking at, and 3 on the reverse side of each column. And so this ritual embrace is depicted 6 times, or a total of 12 times, on the outside of the Holy of Holies here, and it is showing you what the pharaoh has to do. And this lies at the foundation of the Egyptian religion. Now, keep in mind that you have now come to the highest point of that primordial mound. You've come to that highest point, the closest spot to the Holy of Holies, or the presence of God, or the sanctuary, or the celestial room, if you want to call it that. And here the pharaoh must embrace the God. And in that embrace, the pharaoh's on one side, the God is on the other side. And the pharaoh's feet, hands have to be on the shoulder of the God, and the God's hands on the shoulder of Pharaoh, and the feet are always together. You can see it here. This is that same column, but a little bit closer. You can see Amun, the God Amun, on the right, and you can see the Pharaoh on the left. And the God Amun has his hand on the shoulder of Pharaoh, and Pharaoh has his hand on the shoulder of Amun. And again, the feet are together in this ritual embrace. And here's where the Pharaoh, before he's allowed into the presence of God, he has to receive the powers and blessings of exaltation, the powers that make God God. He has to become worthy to be his son and enter into his presence. And as what's being said is the important part up here, and this is just an abbreviated version of what's being said, but it says, I give or I endow you with eternal life like God has for eternity. There's other aspects there that we're going to talk about shortly. And you can see Amun's hand on this one, it's the same place. His hand is facing Amun's hand on the shoulder of Pharaoh is facing him, which means that he's the one doing the talking. He's providing the blessing. That's the hieroglyphic to speak when the hand is that way. These are depictions, the columns, almost every column in the tomb of Seti in the Valley of the Kings, there across from this temple. The ritual embrace is depicted. Notice again, the feet are always together, and the hands are always on the shoulder, and the god giving support or holding the elbow in the cupped hand of the pharaoh in each one of these. And there's multiple ones. This is an old one, which is interesting because it shows the priest that's involved. This particular carving was chipped out. It had been used as a chapel, as a Christian chapel later on. And so the faces were chipped out because of the Christian or the biblical statement not to have any graven images. And so they would often, when an Egyptian temple was used as a church or a chapel, the faces were chipped out. But you can see it's basically the same on each side. It's a mirror image except for the crown of Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt being different. But the lector priest is behind the pharaoh on each one of these. And the lector priest is wearing a garment of skin. You can see that it's a skin. It's an animal skin that he's wearing. He's wearing a garment of skin, and he's presenting proof or presenting to the pharaoh the ma'at, or the symbol of ma'at, which is everything true and just and right and good, everything perfect, the character that the pharaoh is to have in order to embrace Amun and become his son and worthy to be in his presence. So that's what's going on here. This is very typical. This is actually in these columns, and the ritual embrace is depicted on each side of each column in the chapel of Anubis here at the temple of Hatshepsut, the funerary temple of Hatshepsut, there at Deir el-Bahari. And each side of each column depicts this ritual embrace. Again, the feet together and the hands on the shoulder. But the important thing is what's being said down here at the bottom. In the ritual embrace, the God conveys the redeemed, the powers that make God God, making the individual a son of God. And it begins in that top line. It says Meret. I don't translate that, but Meret means my beloved. My beloved. Then it says D. I endow or I give unto thee, and then two words over thy posterity. But he says, I give unto you and your posterity. I give immortality to you and your posterity. Jed, it's the Jed column, which means stability or endurance, but it has to do with the dynasty, with the posterity of that pharaoh, the dynasty, that it will endure, that it will have stability within the kingdom. So he says, I endow thee and thy posterity with eternal life. And then it says it's the Wa'as scepter, which represents priesthood authority, or the authority of God, Wa'as. And then it says Seneb, it's actually spelled out S-N-B, Seneb, which means eternal health. And then it ends like God has for eternity, is the grammatical way to say it. Like God has for eternity. And in a nutshell, the abbreviation that we see often is Diank Jet Wa'as Seneb. That's all over the place. So the earthly representation of this primordial mound, or center of the earth, is always the temple, ancient and modern, and has always been associated with creation. Brigham Young stated that no two temples should be constructed exactly alike because they have to represent the creation. They can be the same in function and purpose, but they're not to be constructed alike because they have to represent the creation. And to create is not to copy. And so you can see, as we have temples, some can be very similar, but they're always a little bit different because they have to represent that creation. Each one of them have an ascension motif, and are either built on a hill or on a temenos, which is an artificial primordial mound. The oldest written document in the world is called the Shabaka stone, and it comes from the Temple of Menes at Memphis. And in that temple, I mean, it is the oldest written document that exists in the world. It's in the British Museum, and that Shabaka stone, this is what it looks like. It was carved on the stone when they found the papyrus that had been worm-eaten, and that's what it tells you at the top up there. But it was a play that was actually performed in the temple, and it gives stage directions. So-and-so enters from the right and says, Ptah enters in and says, and Horus enters in from the left and says, and it's a temple play. And again, it's the oldest written document in the world, and it's a play that is to be acted out in the temple. But it's a play about the creation. And in this particular text, it says that Ptah created all things by the word of his mouth, by the word of his power, he created everything. It talks about the council that's going on. He's going to create this new earth, and he's trying to decide which one of his sons should be the god over this earth. And it says he chooses his most beloved son to make him the god, or make him have control over all of this earth. It talks about that there's two different opposing plans for who's going to be, and as the myth goes on, as we see elsewhere, and had we held the whole text, we might see it, that the wicked son ends up killing the favored or the beloved son, who eventually is resurrected and exalted, giving all mankind the power to be resurrected and exalted. So the earthly representation of this primordial mound, or center of the earth, is always the temple and associated with the three worlds, the world of the gods, the world of the living, and the world of the dead. We see this in the pyramids. Now this is a diagram of the Great Pyramid there in Giza. And you can see they have three different chambers there. Now most people believe that the king's chamber up at the top was where the pharaoh was buried, and then you have the queen's chamber in the middle, and then you have the subterranean chamber down at the bottom. But you cannot find anywhere at any age that the pharaoh's remains or the sarcophagus with his remains are inside the pyramid. They are always below it, and and it represents the world of the gods, the world of the living, and the world of the dead, or what we might call the underworld. And I've made kind of I've taken some videos and tried to put together so that you can kind of see how this is. This is just for fun. But again, keeping in mind that the pyramids of Giza always represent these primordial mounds. That's the entrance there, and it's on the north side. It's on the north side of the pyramid there, and that was the one where Belzoni got in. But again, each pyramid represents that primordial mound. Now, this is going to break apart here so that you can actually kind of see what goes on here, because it's quite interesting how they tried to block the treasures off. It's not only trying to block the body off, but the treasures also. So there's a pathway that comes from the entrance, and then there's one that goes horizontal. This one goes horizontal until it gets to the queen's chamber, which is right here. This would be what's called the queen's chamber, down below what's called the king's chamber. Now the king's chamber up here, they found and it's all made out of red granite. They found this, what they assume is a sarcophagus here, which it may or may not be. But as they would bring the pharaoh in there, they had a system here where they had 3 blocks that would drop down, and these are the actual pictures of the paths for those blocks to drop down. These are the slots for the ropes that would hold up those paths. So after they got the king in there, they would release these ropes, and then these 3 blocks would drop down. They would drop down in order to block the way into the treasury, or the king's chamber, be it his body or be it the treasures. Once those came down, then there were 3 other blocks that would slide down that grand gallery. And then those 3 blocks, when they would slide down there, they would block the entrance at the other end. And that's how they would protect it, so that be it a tomb or be it the treasures, that these things would be perfectly sealed, and that the tomb robbers would be kept out. But of course, it seems that tomb robbers made it into every tomb, at least except for Tutankhamun's that we know of. And so that's the way it's It has been. Tomb robbers are always there, but each pyramid and each burial representing that primordial mound. Again, this is the north entrance there, the original entrance to the pyramids there at Giza. And always, always representing the primordial mound. You'll hear all kinds of things about what they represent and why they built pyramids, but they always represent the primordial mound, the closest point between heaven and earth, and the coming together of the three worlds. And who wouldn't want to be buried at the closest point between heaven and earth? Well, this is St. Peter's. This is a diagram of St. Peter's, and I want to show you this coming together of these three worlds. And again, we were talking about a journey to the center of the earth, and that's really what all this is about. And I want to show you how it's not only in our religion, but many other religions, ancient as well as modern, have this. And this is the diagram of the center of St. Peter's there at the Vatican in Rome. It represents the cross. There's always the cross, or the coming together of the four corners. It's not the cross. It doesn't necessarily represent the cross of the crucifixion, as much as it represents the coming together of the four corners of the world, the four pillars of heaven, and it represents that center point. And they're always oriented. Every cathedral is oriented to the east and the west and the north and the south. There's an orientation there. This one also has the compass, or the circle, that's represented in that center point there. It also has the square, and the square that Joseph Smith tells us is the seal or the sign of Melchizedek, and we see that often all over the place. So you have the coming together of the three, or the point of intersection of the compass, as well as the square, and then the square in the square. And here we see kind of an elevation of that particular of St. Peter's. This is, as you see on the top, this is looking at the inside, at the center of the inside. Now, again, talking about the three worlds coming together. St. Peter's is constructed because they believe the tomb of Peter is there. But we have the altar, which represents the world of the living. That's where the altar is in St. Peter's. Directly underneath that is where they believe the tomb of Peter is. And then you have the canopy up above, which represents the heavens, which is right under the dome. So you have the four columns, or the four pillars of heaven here, and the canopy, which represents heaven, over the top of the altar, which represents the world of the living, over the top of the tomb of Peter, which represents the world of the dead. So all three worlds are coming together at this point, the center, what's called the center of the earth. This is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, in the old city in Jerusalem, and it has the same concept. You have the dome above on the left. You see the dome above on the left, which represents the heavens, or the world of the gods. Then you have this building down below that, which is a chapel that is over the top of the tomb, the world of the living. It's the chapel for the living, the funerary temple, so to speak, as it would be called in Egypt, over the tomb of Christ. And so right at this particular point, you have the world of the gods up above, the world of the living, where the people are walking in, and then they have to go down into the world of the dead, where they believe the tomb of Christ is. The picture on the right is taken from up on top. You can see those high arch windows, or it looks like windows. They're not windows on the left there. That's where the picture is taken on the Festival of Lights in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre there. We even process in our own graveyards, we process this concept of the primordial mound even in our headstones. They're rounded on the top, representing that primordial mound, or again, that closest point between heaven and earth. And you can see this concept in many of the different ways of burial, or the places of burial and tombs around the world. We've got an altar, a Middle Eastern or Israeli altar down below, or a model of one. You have a Canaanite altar on the right that's there at Megiddo, which is circular, but they're always raised. You have to go up because that altar represents that primordial mound. And then all of the other pictures there are tombs, and notice how they're either in the shape of an altar or on an altar, or represent a pyramid or a temple, because they all represent that closest point between heaven and earth. That's where you want to be buried, represent that primordial mound. There's an interesting thing also about beds, the canopies, as well as the four-poster bed. the four posts, the canopies of a Jewish wedding. You have the canopy above, and then you have the four posts, the four corners. They represent the four corners of the world, or the four pillars of heaven. And in the center of those four pillars is the center point, the closest point between heaven and earth. The canopy represents the heaven, and the coming together of those four corners is where the couple will stand. The bed, the four-poster bed with the canopy, also represents the same thing. The bed in the world of the living, the canopy, the world of the gods, and the four posts representing the four pillars of heaven, or the four corners of the earth. It's an interesting thing about this older concept of the four-poster bed, because it's the bed where man is conceived. It's on the bed where man is born. It's on the bed where man lives. It's on the bed where man gets sick. It's on the bed where man dies. And it's from the bed, the symbolic bed below that, where man is resurrected from. And so this concept of the center of the earth, or primordial mound, is throughout our culture and many other cultures that we're not even aware of. Mountains in the scriptures are always the meeting places for prophets with God, and we see this with the brother of Jared, as that going up to the mountain where the Lord parts the veil and puts his hand through. The brother of Jared falling backwards, saying that he knew not that God had a body of flesh and bones, and then the brother of Jared is redeemed from the fall. He's pronounced and made clean, and then he's admitted into the presence of God and cannot be kept without the veil, because he no longer has faith, and he enters into an environment where the past, present, and future are continually manifest, and he is told that he has seen the body that I shall take upon myself, 2,700 years before it even happens. So he enters into an environment that nobody has. Christ had come out many times from that environment to the earth, but this is one time that someone and the brother of Jared went the other direction, into an environment without time, and could not be kept without the veil. We see Abraham, Moses going up to the mount, Nephi taken up to the mount by the Spirit. See, all of these are going up to mountains, to these places, the closest point between heaven and earth, to meet with God. One thing we always talk about, Peter and the rock, and there's something interesting. If anybody knows what the rock is, it's Peter. We learn in Matthew 16, when Christ says, I say unto thee that thou art Peter, and upon this rock I'll build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. We're all familiar with that chapter and verse. But there's something interesting. We always say, well, the rock always represents revelation, which it can do, and there's nothing wrong with that. But if anybody knows what that rock is, it's really Peter. Peter knows who the rock is, and he mentions in his book that Christ is that rock. Christ and his atonement. He calls Christ the atonement a living stone, a chief cornerstone, a stone a stone disallowed, that people rejected, that he's the head of the corner, and that he's a stone of stumbling for those who end up rejecting him and that atonement and resurrection. And he's sometimes called, and Peter calls him, that he becomes a rock of offense to those who want to reject him. And so if anybody knows what the rock is, it's Peter. And Peter says it's almost in all of these things in almost 4 verses, and you can see it here in 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 4 through 8, just 4 verses, is where he lists it: a living stone, a chief cornerstone, the stone which the builders disallowed, the head of the corner, the stone of stumbling, and a rock of offense. Well, looking at this particular passage in Matthew 16, these 3 worlds, the world of the living, the world of the gods, and the world of the dead, Christ brings together in this particular passage, which is very interesting, and it gives us the real meaning of the passage. And he says to Peter, I say unto thee that thou art Peter, and upon this rock I'll build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Well, it's a different word for Peter and a different word for rock. We always say, well, Peter's the same as the rock. Well, it's not. It's Petros. And it says, if you look at the Greek, he says, I say unto thee that thou art a Petros, which means a small stone, like a seer stone. He says, thou art a Petros, but upon this Petra, that's the stone of creation, the center of the world, the axis mundi, the primordial mound. That's what Petra means. And he says to Peter, you're like a small stone. But upon this foundation stone, the center of the world, the stone of creation, which Peter says is Christ and the atonement, will I build my church. And it doesn't say the gates of hell, but it says the gates of Hades, which is the spirit world, or the world of the dead. And it says, shall not prevail, which means remain closed or hold in the spirit. So it's what it's saying is, Christ is saying to Peter, he says, you're like a small stone, but upon the foundation stone of the atonement and resurrection I will build my church, and the gates of the spirit world will no longer be able to hold in those spirits. That's what it's actually saying. Now, we always say, well, it means revelation, but it's way more than that. And if you notice what he's doing in there, he's bringing the three worlds together. The spirit world and the world of the living. And then he says, you're going to be able to do this, or I'm going to be able to do this. Church is going to be built up this way, because I'm going to give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, that whatsoever you bind on earth for the living and the dead, because the context is speaking of those in Hades, shall be bound in heaven, and whatsoever thou loose on earth for the living and the dead shall be loosed in heaven. And so Christ is bringing the three worlds together. Peter is going to have the keys in the world of the living to bind those in the world of the dead in the world of the gods, because that's where time and space ceases to exist. That's where the three worlds come together. That's why we in the church the living can do work for the dead that will be binding in the world of the gods in these temples. So Christ brings together the priesthood, the creation, and the three worlds just in these 2 or 3 verses in this particular passage. The foundation stone, the primordial mound, the center of all life and creation, the axis mundi, the center of the earth, the tree of life, sometimes called the navel of the earth, Mount Tabor. Tabor means navel, but the navel of the earth, where the earth gets its life from, is always Christ, his sacrifice, his atonement and resurrection. It's the gospel of Jesus Christ. He is the stone upon which the church must be built. The atonement and resurrection opens the gates of the spirit world, and the keys of his authority given to his servants provides the necessary authority to bind and seal on earth and in heaven all who live and all who die. And this is just a symbolic journey to the center of the earth and what it represents, both not only for us to a certain extent, but to some of those ancients, as it does as we saw in the Egyptian temples. Again, the rule of my classes is that you don't have to believe a word I say. You have the scriptures and you have the prophets as your sources, not me.